Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to our channel and thanks for logging on. Today we have a shootout between all-arounders. There are harder core aquatic watches in the collections of Omega and Rolex than the Aqua Terra and the Yacht-Master respectively. It frees up these two model lines to offer a more versatile all-around sports watch experience. These are equally at home on the deck of the yacht, in the water alongside, or in the ballroom of the yacht club. So let's talk about the all-arounders in the Omega and Rolex catalogs, because in many ways, though different in construction, these two watches are equivalent of each other. Let's talk about the Omega first. The Aqua Terra, part of the Seamaster line, took over the role of what was previously called the Seamaster 120 back in 2002 when the first of the Aqua Terras launched. Now in the late 2000s, the Aqua Terras were redesigned to look as this one looks on my wrist. 41.5 millimeters in stainless steel. You can see that the watch on a 16 centimeter circumference wrist is full-sized but not oversized. It's not thick. 13 millimeters with a sloped bezel means this one slides easily underneath a dress cuff. And from lug to lug, two ways to measure this watch. You can see across the wrist, the timepiece is 48.4 millimeters if you just include the lugs, but if you include the solid end links of the bracelet, and they do add a little bit of flare, then the watch has a more substantial 50.4 millimeters across the wrist, so it adds 2 millimeters to the total distance across the wrist. I'd recommend this watch for a wrist as small as 14 centimeters circumference. The spacing between the lugs is 20 millimeters, so if you want to throw this one on a strap of some kind, 20 millimeters would be the size. The bracelet's pretty good looking. I have to say, all things considered, Omega did its homework with this design, and it wound up with a substantial sports bracelet of a 3-link construction that nevertheless is not derivative of the Rolex Oyster. And let me show you exactly what I mean. 3-link sports watch designs are almost always Rolex Oyster knockoffs, but you can see with the Oyster, the individual links are a little bit longer and a little bit narrower, including down the center, whereas when you look at the construction of the Omega bracelet, the links are a bit more squared off on their side. They're also a bit shorter end to end, but broader across the center. So Omega did a good job of building a substantial and handsome sports bracelet that isn't simply a Rolex wannabe. Underside, big gaps to vent the wrist, avoid pinching skin, pulling hair, removable links fixed by screws, and you can see on each side of the clasp there's actually a half link, so you can do a little bit of micro sizing and tailoring. You'll also note that the clasp is a double fold. It's got a ceramic pin snap in there to maintain tight tolerances over time, and that's an impressive refinement to ensure that the bracelet never really develops any play within the clasp. You can see it's a sequential close because one side closes before the other. It's twin trigger release, which is quite different from the lift lock and clamshell lock system you see on the Rolex. You also note that the clasp itself is less bulky, so it's got less of a profile and less of a propensity to incur diving, or desk diving I should say, damage. You can see how much bigger and blockier the Rolex Oyster clasp is. This one's going to take the brunt of the impact on your desk as you move your hands in and out over the keyboard. Let's jump back to the Omega real quick. The case band is familiar and well worn. It's what you basically expect if you've been paying attention to Omega Seamaster and Speedmaster models for the past 50 plus years. You can see the lyre style lugs, they turn inward on their inward face and they slope down that way, but they also slope down towards their outward face. Polished bevels that continue from end to end, a mid case with a longitudinal satin finish. You can see pre-2017 there was a little bit of a shear guard profile on a countersink of the crown inside the case to protect it. You'll also note the attention to detail is excellent with a blasted base on the crown and then a polished and relieved Omega logo. A conical bezel, relatively narrow, and then a sensational black lacquered dial. Let me pull in a polishing cloth and get some of those fingerprints off, because this black lacquer dial is sensational. You could see applied rose gold indices, rose gold Omega logo and marquee, rose gold hands, and then a lovely Omega wave in a gloss lacquer with a combination of gray and black, and it is an awfully animated dial that's glossy and highly reflective, so it has a lot of life to it. And you can see just how much height and loft there is to those applied features. There's also a slightly sunken seconds and minutes track outboard, a trapezoidal aperture for a monotone date disc that blends in nicely and disappears when you want it to. The movement has a few tricks up its sleeve. You've got conventional stop seconds, but then you've also got a time zone capability that allows you to move the hour hand without actually moving the minutes or stopping the seconds hand. And you can see how I can actually jump across the international date line while traveling and move the date in either direction. This is a wonderful feature for those who travel frequently. Screw the crown down and it has 150 meter water resistance, It's also effectively amagnetic because of the use of a silicone hairspring. Omega calls that SI14. Let's get a little bit closer here and get a better look at the case back. You can see the movement's good looking. 8500, 60-hour power reserve, twin mainspring barrels, so it doesn't have the amplitude drop off after 24 hours that you get with the Rolex. Stop seconds, the time zone feature. It is a coaxial escapement as envisioned by George Daniels in the 70s and perfected by Omega in the 2000s. 2019 represents 20 years of the Omega coaxial, so they've really got these things dialed in. It beats away at a quirky 25,200 vibration per hour beat rate, 38 joules. You can see full bridge with a free sprung index for shock resistance. It's got the works. COSC certified Swiss chronometer. It's also quite precise. Now let's take a look at the Rolex. Okay, the Rolex is a different kind of watch. Come back into focus here. There we go. The Rolex has a rotating bezel, and the bezel is crafted of platinum. So while it's principally stainless steel like the Omega, it is an interesting bimetallic. This is what Rolex calls Rolesium, which is an alloy-sounding name for two metals that are basically physically cobbled together. That's perhaps underselling the quality of the finish of the watch. It is nicely made, but there is no such thing as Rolesium. That said, the watch has impressive presence on the wrist. I'll zoom out a little bit more so you can even see it in proportion. My wrist, again, 16 centimeters in circumference. Where's the Rolex well? 40 millimeters in diameter. It's not that different from the 41.5 of the Omega, but it is considerably slimmer. In profile, the Omega 13, the Rolex 11.6, you do feel it, you do notice it. Also, the Rolex from lug to lug, if you were to measure just the case across the wrist, you'll find it's 47.4 millimeters, and if you include the solid end links of the watch, it's almost identical to the Omega at 50 millimeters on the nose, 20 millimeter spacing between the lugs, but rest assured you're not going to take the Oyster bracelet off this thing. It is incredibly well made and a perfect visual match for the timepiece. Again, I'm going to recruit my polishing cloth to relieve this watch of my fingerprints, and you can see there are some differences in the construction of the Oyster versus the Omega. The most noticeable difference for me is that there's more of a pronounced taper to the Oyster, which makes it appear just a bit more refined and elegant, and that's a feature that's largely lacking in the largely straight cut and minimally tapered Omega bracelet. Now jumping back to the Oyster, you can see like the Omega, all of the removable links are fixed by screws. Unlike the Omega, there are no half links. And there are two different closure systems. There's a hook and a beak. That's a lift lock system, so you actually can't pull this clasp open when the clamshell's up. The clamshell closes and provides another degree of security, not the only degree of security. Internally, you've got Easy Link, which is a tool-free 5mm adjustment system. It's the equivalent of adding or removing one link, and then you can see that there are actually a couple of divots drilled inside the clasp, 3 of them that allow you to change the anchoring point of the bracelet in the clasp. So that's what Rolex offers in lieu of a half link, and allows you to do some sizing without actually removing or adding links. Jump into the case, you can see it is considerably thinner than that of the Omega and more graceful. It doesn't have the sheer side, nor does it have the somewhat, I would even say, haggard lyre-style lugs on the Omega. This is a case profile no longer widely used on Rolex watches, so it hasn't become quite as tiresome or played out as that lyre-style lug on the Omega. This is a case design that you really only see on the Yacht-Master and the Daytona, and you'll see that right down to these sort of flatted out feet under the lugs. The Yacht-Master really looks a lot like the Daytona in profile, and it's a graceful look for a hardcore sports watch. You can see the bezel, solid platinum. It's a blasted base with relieved and raised numerals and indices. It's bidirectional because this is not a dive watch. This is a yachtsman's watch, and a yachtsman is a sportsman, so he needs to be able to count down to the start of a match within a regatta. So you line up that polished triangular index with the minute hand. Now you've got an impromptu 0 to 60 minute timer. This is a feature you don't get on the Omega, but again, bidirectional. This is not a dive watch. The dial is a sensational sunburst blue that you would have seen when this model, the 116622, bowed back at Basel 2012. You could see that there are well-chosen splashes of white and white gold and red. All of the indices as well as the hands are white gold. The shocks of red, Yacht-Master in the second hand, well chosen, and a Cyclops eye. Prominent perhaps, maybe even a little bit obnoxious to some. This is as played out as the Omega lug profile. All the same, it is very, very functional. Underneath the case back, which is solid, Rolex caliber 3135, 48-hour power reserve, stop seconds, quick set date, free sprung balance with a full balance bridge like the Omega for shock resistance, and overcoil hairspring unlike the Omega to help the watch better keep time in any orientation with respect to gravity. And it uses a parachrom anti-magnetic alloy that is good, but not quite as anti-magnetic as the silicon in the Omega. Now, COSC certified Swiss chronometer, so they match blows on that count. Screw down crown, 100 meters water resistant versus 150 for the Omega. And of course the watch is quite slender because the 3135 is not a terribly chunky automatic movement. So let's talk about the advantages of these two watches. First, the Rolex. You cannot deny Rolex prestige is a thing. It was said that at Pebble Beach last year you were either wearing a Rolex, a Richard Mille, or a Patek Philippe. I don't necessarily love the sentiment, but it really says something when a watch you can buy used for about $10,500 can rub elbows with RM and Patek Philippe on equal terms. That's impressive, and that's something this watch offers if that's important to you. A longer history. The Yacht-Master came out in 1992. The Aqua Terra was the successor to the Seamaster 120, and it came out in 2002. So this is a more established part of the Rolex catalog than the Aqua Terra is, the Omega catalog. It is so much thinner and more graceful. It is more beautiful. It more easily slips underneath the cuff, and if you're going to wear a watch as a sports watch and a dress watch, this one achieves virtuoso aesthetic in both modes. That's something the Aqua Terra does not. I'll also mention that the clasp is superior. It's more substantial. It gives you the Easy Link tool-free adjustment and the 3 different incremental divots. It also matches the lift lock system with the clamshell for greater security. So that's what the Rolex has to offer. Let's talk about what the Omega has to offer. The Omega has, first and foremost, technology on its side. The Omega offers you 60 hours of power reserve and a twin mainspring barrel arrangement, so it has more power reserve than the 48 hours of the Rolex, but it's also better at maintaining amplitude beyond 24 hours than the Rolex, which tends to fall off. It has a coaxial escapement, so you have a link to George Daniels, the great independent watchmaker who invented that system in the early 1970s, and it's in your mainstream mass-produced watch. How cool is that? You have the travel time system that allows you to set that hour hand independently, so you have the ability to jump that hour hand as you travel without actually stopping the watch. I'll also mention that in terms of setting, when you set the Omega, there's less play in the hands, and it's easier to pinpoint the minute than it is on the Rolex, which has a little tendency to move when you reinsert the crown, and a bit more play when you're trying to find the correct time and synchronize to a reference. Let's talk about value. This is a watch that sold for $6,200 new. Now you'll buy them used for $3,500 to $4,000. Compare that to the $10,500 to $11,000 of the Yacht-Master 116622. I'll also mention that the timepiece has a cleaner profile without the bezel, so it doesn't have the rotating bezel, and a lot of folks will say it doesn't really need it aesthetically. It also lacks the Cyclops eye, and I have no trouble telling you that it's the 31st. No issues seeing the date right here, so the use of a huge contrasting color date wheel and a Cyclops eye magnifier on the Rolex, highly questionable. And that's something. For some folks, aesthetically, this is the win. The tasteful use of two-tone, the technology, the clean case and dial design, and of course the independent horology cool with the George Daniels Association. But for me, it's going to be the Rolex on a couple of fronts. I prefer this watch. I like the bezel. The rotating bezel gives you a timing organ that the Omega does not have, and that's really the final advantage I should have named in favor of the Rolex. That rotating bezel is not that obtrusive. It doesn't really clutter the look, and it does give you impressive functionality, whether you're just timing eggs cooking on the stovetop or you're billing hours at the law firm. It's a fun way to keep the time. Heck, you might even use it while timing the countdown to a match in a regatta. I love the fact that the Rolex has an elegance about it. With the platinum bezel, the solid links, the solid end links, the solid caseback, somehow, maybe it's the solidity of the clasp, it feels more substantial in the hand than the Omega. And it's worth mentioning that sometimes the look of a watch is going to be the first and last consideration. And for me, the Rolex really wins with that platinum bezel, the steel case, the sunburst blue dial, the shocks of red, the oversized white gold indices. This one captures my heart. Even as the Omega appeals to my intellect, this is a watch that, in practical terms, will be just as durable as the 150-meter water-resistant Omega. This is 100, that's 150. I'm never going to dive that deep in either case. And it's going to be just as accurate as the coax in the real world. I've seen these run to less than 1 second per day. So at the end of the day, I'm going to choose the Rolex, even though I will pay almost 4 times the price of one of these used to buy one of these used. To me, the Rolex is worth it, and the final measure of victory for the Rolex will be the Loom Shot, which you're about to see. Let me know in the comments below which of these two watches you choose, given the choice between the two. That's the Rolex. That's the Omega. I think that one clearly flows to the Rolex.